Welcome back to our series on the Old Testament book of Ruth, which happens to be one of only two books in the entire Bible that is named after a woman. And if you were not with us last Sunday as we began the series, or if you'd like to listen to the first message once again, just go to our website, go to our YouTube channel, or even Spotify, and you'll be able to pick up the message. So last Sunday we looked at chapter 1. Today we're going to look at chapter 2. So let's listen to it. Thank you.
Now there was a wealthy and influential man in Bethlehem named Boaz, who was a relative of Naomi's husband, Elimelech.
One day Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi,
"Let me go out into the harvest fields to pick up the stalks of grain left behind by anyone who is kind enough to let me do it."
Naomi replied,
"All right, my daughter, go ahead."
So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happened, she found herself working in a field that belonged to Boaz, the relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. While she was there, Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters.
"The Lord be with you,"
he said.
"The Lord bless you."
The harvesters replied. Then Boaz asked his foreman,
"Who is that young woman over there? Who does she belong to?"
And the foreman replied,
"She is the young woman from Moab who came back with Naomi. She asked me this morning if she could gather grain behind the harvesters. She has been hard at work ever since, except for a few minutes' rest in the shelter."
Boaz went over and said to Ruth,
"Listen, my daughter, stay right here with us when you gather grain. Don't go to any other fields. Stay right behind the young women working in my field. See which part of the field they are harvesting and then follow them. I have warned the young men not to treat you roughly. And when you are thirsty, help yourself to the water they have drawn from the well."
Ruth fell at his feet and thanked him warmly.
"What have I done to deserve such kindness?"
she asked.
"I am only a foreigner."
"Yes, I know,"
Boaz replied.
"but I also know about everything you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. I have heard how you left your father and mother and your own land to live here among complete strangers. May the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge, reward you fully for what you have done."
"I hope I continue to please you, sir,"
she replied.
"You have comforted me by speaking so kindly to me, even though I am not one of your workers."
At mealtime, Boaz called to her.
"Come over here and help yourself to some food. You can dip your bread in the sour wine."
So she sat with the harvesters, and Boaz gave her some roasted grain to eat. She ate all she wanted and still had some left over. When Ruth went back to work again, Boaz ordered his young men,
"Let her gather grain right among the sheaves without stopping her, and pull out some heads of barley from the bundles and drop them on purpose for her. Let her pick them up, and don't give her a hard time."
So Ruth gathered barley there all day, and when she beat out the grain that evening, it filled an entire basket. She carried it back into town and showed it to her mother-in-law. Ruth also gave her the roasted grain that was left over from her meal.
"Where did you gather all this grain today?"
Naomi asked.
"Where did you work? May the Lord bless the one who helped you."
So Ruth told her mother-in-law about the man in whose field she had worked. She said,
"The man I worked with today is named Boaz."
"May the Lord bless him.
Naomi told her daughter-in-law,
He is showing his kindness to us as well as to your dead husband. That man is one of our closest relatives, one of our family redeemers."
Then Ruth said,
"What's more, Boaz even told me to come back and stay with his harvesters until that entire harvest is completed."
"Good,"
Naomi exclaimed.
"Do as he said, my daughter. Stay with his young women right through the whole harvest. You might be harassed in other fields, but you'll be safe with him."
So Ruth worked alongside the women in Boaz's fields and gathered grain with them until the end of the barley harvest. Then she continued working with them through the wheat harvest in early summer, and all the while she lived with her mother-in-law.
So right, that's chapter 2. Let's look at it. Chapter 2 begins by introducing us to another one of the main characters that we find in the book of Ruth. Verse 1, Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. Now, these few words tell us a lot about the story of Ruth. Naomi comes back to Bethlehem, now a widow. Both her sons are dead. And that's not only that. Not only is she a widow, not only are her sons dead, but her father apparently is no longer alive, and there is no record of her having a brother. Now, in the culture of the day, this meant that she had no one to protect her, to look after her, to be responsible for her. No one was there to supply her needs. She was completely on her own. She was totally independent, no one to care for her. And Ruth is in a similar situation. These were two extremely vulnerable women. And then this is dropped into the story. There is a male relative in the mix, and he's rich. Okay? Now, why is this so significant? Well, in the Jewish culture, certainly during these days of the Old Testament, if a father or husband died, the closest male relative of the father's or husband's side could step in and take over some of the responsibilities. He would become what is known the kinsman redeemer, or as the translation that we used this morning, the family redeemer. Now, this meant that this person, they could step in and care for the family. This could include Mary, the widow, if she had no children, so that they could provide for a future. It could also involve buying back land that a poor relative may have had to sell to somebody outside the family. It could mean buying the freedom of a relative who had sold himself into slavery. And by the way, when we talk about slavery in Israel, the nation had a very different concept of what we think of when we talk about slavery. The slavery that is mentioned in the Old Testament, and certainly within the society in Israel, that is condoned and in fact given permission by the laws established by Moses, it was nothing the slavery that we had seen happening in other countries, or in fact even in the world today. The whole idea of slavery within the Israeli concept was more of a willing servitude. You could sell yourself into slavery, and you could buy yourself out of slavery once again. Now, these were opportunities that slaves nowhere else could ever experience. In Israel, slaves could buy their freedom once again. And a kinsman could redeem them and take them out of slavery if they had willingly become a slave. Being a kinsman redeemer also meant that they could help the needy. They could help a member of the family who was in dire straits, such as an orphan. They could even avenge the killing of a family relative. But if you notice the language that I've used all the time, they could do that, but they didn't have to do that. They had the legal right to do so, but only if they desired to become involved. And it wasn't just about willingness. It was also about money. It was about wealth. Even if you wanted to function as a family redeemer, a kinsman, for a relative, it usually meant that you had to have money. And in the story of Ruth, in just one single sentence, potentially, everything changes for Naomi, and there's an extension for Ruth. There is a very rich male relative living in Bethlehem who could, if he wanted, change their lives altogether. And his name is Boaz. So what happens next? Verse 2. And Ruth the Moabite said to Naomi, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind everyone in whose eye I find favor." And Naomi said to her, "Go ahead, my daughter." As with verse 1, there is so much that comes out of just these few words. Now, there was a custom in those days that was kind of designed to care for the poorest of the poor. It's kind of a benefit scheme, if you can use that term. And we need to understand a bit of the harvesting in Israel to get a full picture of what's involved here. So if you can see a field full of ripened grain standing tall, ready to be cut down, ready for the harvest, man would come along and cut it down. Then they would be followed by a group of women who would bind the stalks of grain together and put them into bundles. It would look something like what we have on the screen up there. Now, in the process of collecting the grain, often there will be strained stalks of wheat or barley that will be left on the ground. In other words, this wasn't always a very neat process. You couldn't pick up everything that the men had taken down. And then the poor would go behind them, behind everybody else, and gather these bits of grain and stalks that have been left on the ground, that have been left as the women collected the harvest. Now, this was called gleaning. Now, this was done because in Israel there was a law that once a crew had gone through the fields, they could not go back to glean themselves. They had to leave the grain that had been left behind. And this was left for the poor, for the widows, for the orphans, so that they could be cared for. There was some form of sustenance for them during summer. Now, you can imagine that the crew were quite careful about not leaving that much behind, leaving as little as possible. Not only do they wanted the crop for themselves, particularly if they're working for somebody else, but also because they couldn't go back to pick it up. Okay, they had one shot at getting the harvest, and they would try to get as much as they could out of the fields. And even though it was law, they really resented the people who came and picked up what they had missed. In essence, these people were getting something which was not theirs, and I said just now, if they were working for somebody else, it meant that their wages would also be reduced. So if you got too close to where they were working, in other words, you moved from gleaning to harvesting, there was a pretty good chance that you'd be beaten up. And since there were no legal systems like we have today, they would often be beaten up brutally and driven off the land. And if you were a woman alone, often they'll be sexually abused as well and assaulted. As a woman out there, gleaning by yourself, it clearly stated, like one big sign, I have no man in my life, I have no one who will protect me, I have no one who will come and defend me, I'm totally defenseless. Now keep this in mind as you listen to the words of Naomi found at the end of chapter 2. Go ahead, my daughter. See, Naomi knows the situation. She knows what happens in these fields. But there seems to be no sign of concern for what might happen to Ruth. Remember, she's a foreigner. No offer to warn her of the dangers. And certainly there's no offer to go with her and work in the fields as well. So Ruth went out to gather grain behind the harvesters. And as it happens, she finds herself working in the fields that belonged to Boaz, was a relative of her father-in-law, Elimelech. And this is where it kind of begins to get interesting in the story. Okay. This field that she's gone to is the field of her kinsman redeemer, the family redeemer. Let's carry on. Verse 4. Just then Boaz arrived from Bethlehem and greeted the harvesters. The Lord be with you. The Lord bless you, they answered. Okay, and now I'm stopping after reading verse by verse, and you begin to wonder, how long is this going to take? Okay. Well, this kind of beginning is fairly significant, so let's stay with me for a little bit. This is our first introduction to Boaz. He greets the workers with, the Lord be with you, and they know him well enough to reply with an equally spiritual answer, the Lord bless you. Now, I have never worked in the agricultural industry. I've never spent time working in the fields, but from all that I've read, what I've seen and heard, I have the feeling that the topic of conversation is not that spiritual. I have the feeling that if you found a field where people were handpicking fruit, for instance, and you went to them and you said to them and greeted them, "The Lord bless you," I have the feeling that you might not get, "And the Lord bless you too." Okay? God's name may come up, but in a totally different way. And the same would have been in Ruth's day. But Boaz apparently had this deep faith, and he greeted his employees in the light of his faith. And they respected him, or they were afraid of him enough to do the same. Which in a way kind of talks a lot about his character, his integrity, and his reputation. So let's keep going. Verses 5 to 7. Boaz asked the overseer of his harvesters, "Who does that young woman belong to?" And the overseer replied, "She's a Moabite who came back from Moab with Naomi. She said, 'Please let me glean and gather among the sheaves beyond the harvesters.' She came into the field and has remained here from morning until now, except for a short rest in the shelter." Now, verse 4 tells us something about Boaz. As we move to verses 5 to 7, it tells us a few things about Ruth. Firstly, she was probably attractive. Now, we don't quite read that in the text, but there are only two reasons why Boaz would have asked for her specifically. One is that she was the only person working in the fields, and that was extremely unlikely. This was the time when people were harvesting. This is the time that the poor really had to be able to get some sustenance for themselves. So it is extremely unlikely that she was the only person gleaning in the fields. The other reason is that probably she stood out of her way because of her physical appearance, or at least because of her age, her young side. So she was probably attractive. Secondly, she was humble. Though she had the right to go into the fields, she still asked for permission. Being willing to state her need, being willing to let people know where she stood, that she had no support, she had no one to care for her, and in a way to throw herself onto the kindness of others. Third, she was a hardworking person. Even the other workers commented on how hard they had seen her working. Her work ethic was a strong one. Now, Ruth didn't know that Boaz was a kinsman redeemer, a family redeemer. But Boaz knew it, okay? When he was told that this was the widow of the son of Elimelech, he knew precisely where he stood and what the relationship was. And this is what he did next, verses 8 and 9. So Boaz said to Ruth, "My daughter, listen to me. Don't go and glean in another field, and don't go away from here. Stay here with my servant girls. Watch the field where the men are harvesting, and follow along with the girls. I've told the man not to touch you. Remember all that I said about the background of gleaning. And whenever you are thirsty, go and get a drink from the water jars that the men have filled." And in these verses, we see that Boaz gives some very explicit instructions for Ruth's well-being. Stay in the fields among my girls. He then tells her that he has warned the man to leave her alone or to take advantage of her in any way. And then, really important, to allow her to drink from their water. Again, let's try to understand this. For us living in a different day, in a different culture, we just don't see how important this was. But what happened is that as the workers were in the field, and this was hard work, they needed to drink to keep on going. Now, the workers would have their water supply, but those that came gleaning behind them didn't have a water supply. They couldn't carry the water with them. And so they either were in the fields for a short period of time, or then really struggled to be able to work under the sun and in such hot conditions. Most of them would have to leave after a couple of hours, which meant they would not be able to get enough grain to sustain themselves. And so what Boaz is offering is a massive gift to Ruth, because it's allowing her to stay and keep on collecting the grain throughout the entire day. And she knew it. Verses 10 to 13. At this, she bowed down with her face to the ground, and she asked him, "Why have I found such favor in your eyes that you noticed me a foreigner?" And Boaz replied, "I've been told all about what you've done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband. How you left your father and mother and your homeland, and you came to live with a people you did not know before. May the Lord repay you for what you've done. May you be richly blessed by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you've come to take comfort." And she replies, "May I continue to find favor in your eyes, my Lord," she said. "You have put me at ease by speaking kindly to your servant, though I have not the standing of one of your servants." Again, something happens, something interesting happens in these verses. Ruth is obviously grateful and responds accordingly. But it is Boaz who surprises us as we look at his answers. When Ruth asked him, "Why are you doing this for me?" did you notice that he didn't say what he could have said? He didn't say, "I'm your kinsman, your family redeemer, and therefore I can do it." He didn't say that he was doing it because he was rich and he could afford to be generous. He didn't say because he was a great guy and he felt that this was the right thing to do. He didn't say anything about himself. What he said was all about Ruth, and specifically how she had been faithful to her mother-in-law, Naomi, and faithful to the God of Israel, where she had come to understand and to worship and to be with his people. Again, try to understand just how radical this was. For many in the ancient days, their gods were geographical. And so if you were in this area, you worshipped this God. And to move to another area meant leaving their gods behind altogether. And somebody that Ruth had been worshiping her entire life, she now changed it for another God. Okay. It was a walk with God, it was a faith with God, it was a relationship with God that moved his heart. And apparently that touched the hearts of other people as well. Naomi had returned after losing her husband, her sons in chapter 1. She comes home with this Moabite girl in tow, and whatever she did or didn't do, it got everyone in the village talking about this amazing woman, just how amazing she was. So Boaz is essentially saying, "You are known for how you have served Naomi, how you have cared for her, how you have loved God and served our God, and in honor of that, I will provide for you." And then he prays a prayer of blessing over her. "May the Lord, the God of Israel, and whose wings you've taken refuge, reward you fully for what you've done." But Boaz isn't done as yet. Let's keep on reading. At mealtime, Boaz said to her, "Come over here, have some bread and dip it in the wine vinegar." When she sat down with the harvesters, he offered her some roasted grain. She ate all that she wanted, and that some left over. As she got up to glean, Boaz gave instructions to his man. "Even if she gathers among the sheaves, in other words, moves to the harvest rather than the gleaning, don't embarrass her. Rather, pull out some stalks from the bundles and leave them for her to pick them up. And don't rebuke her. Don't embarrass her. Don't get in the way." Again, we see that he's doing all that he can to care for her. He honors her at his table, and somewhere along the day they would have all stopped. They would come to one common place where the food was shared, but not those who were gleaning. He makes the exception. He brings her into that group. He presents her with food, makes sure that her labor in the fields is recognized and accepted. He actually says to the workers to let her go right where the harvest is taking place, not just gleaning. And if she keeps on gleaning, make sure that you drop plenty on the ground so she can pick it up. So what happens next? Towards the end of the passage. So Ruth gleaned in the field until evening. They threshed the barley and that she had gathered, and it amounted to about an ephah. Now, this was about worth 2 weeks of food. That's kind of how much she was able to collect. So when Boaz said, leave some for her to get, they did some serious leaving of wheat behind. She carried it back to town, and her mother-in-law saw how much she had gathered. Ruth also brought out and gave her what she had left over after she had eaten enough. Her mother-in-law asked her, where did you glean today? Where did you work? Blessed be the man who took notice of you. Then Ruth told her mother-in-law about the one at whose place she had been working. The name of the man I worked with today is Boaz, she said. Now, note the change in Naomi. The Lord bless him, Naomi said to her daughter-in-law. He has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers, one of the family redeemers, one of the kinsman redeemers. Then Ruth the Moabite said, he even said to me, stay with my workers until they finish harvesting all my grain. Naomi said to Ruth, her daughter-in-law, it will be good for you, my daughter, to go with a woman who work for him, because if you go to somebody else's field, you might be harmed. So Ruth stayed close to the women of Boaz to glean until the barley and the wheat harvests were finished, and she lived with her mother-in-law. 3 things to note as we begin to get to the end of the story. First, the change in Naomi, as I said just now. At the beginning of the day, she didn't care one bit about Ruth going out to glean, knowing fully well what this meant, what could happen to Ruth, just how dangerous this could be. But when Ruth comes home in the evening, having connected with Boaz, suddenly Ruth's safety is a major concern for Naomi. Do as Boaz tells you because you'll be safe. She suddenly realizes this could change our lives completely. It could be the family redeemer. Secondly, Ruth continues to go to the fields of Boaz and continue to be cared for as a result. She worked all the way through the barley harvest, then all the way through the wheat harvest, which meant that she probably worked in the fields for 2.5 to 3 months, maybe even 3.5 months, all under the care and the protection of Boaz. Which then brings us to the third thing that we can note. It's that last line. Let me read it again. And she lived with a mother-in-law. Here's why it is important to take notice of these words. In one day, because of all that Boaz had given to her, the way he was treating her, allowing her to collect, Ruth had gleaned enough food for 2 weeks, which meant that day after day after day, she was bringing home a lot more than she needed, meaning that probably they were selling the surplus, meaning that Ruth didn't have to stay with Naomi. She was becoming financially independent. But she stayed with Naomi. She didn't take advantage of Boaz's support to leave a mother-in-law, to take advantage of her newfound freedom, financial freedom, and to provide for herself and for her future. She stayed faithful and loyal to Naomi. One more thing to note. That fact that Ruth was still living with Naomi tells us that even after 2 to 3, maybe even 3.5 months, Boaz had done nothing else. They were both widows living on their own. He should have, but he didn't take any action to remedy the situation. He should have, and he could have, but he chose not to do anything else apart from the initial support that he had given her. Which then leads us to a section in Ruth's story, which often leads readers and somewhat puzzle as we look at chapter 3. Was Ruth as noble and virtuous a woman as we have painted her to be? Or are some of her decisions somewhat devious, some of the actions that she takes somewhat devious? That's what we're going to look at next Sunday. But for this Sunday, there are a couple of questions that need to be asked and answered. Here's the main question. Does Ruth chapter 2 have any practical application for us today. If you remember last Sunday, Matt said that if we look at the responses of all the people in chapter 1, we discover one important lesson. When faced with a famine, rather than trusting God, this family moved to a country they shouldn't have. They knew they shouldn't have taken that step, kind of hoping to find a solution to their problems. Knowing this was contrary to what God would want from them, rather than trusting God, they chose to trust themselves. The end result is that they ended up drifting away from God, at least for a while. Trust in ourselves, our abilities, our resources, rather than trusting God. Now, chapter 2 gives us another insight of what we should do when we are faced with challenges in life. And here it is. Trust God, know that He's dependable, He's trustworthy, but don't use that as an excuse not to do anything about your situation. Naomi's response to the situation was to do nothing. You could even say that she just sat around with a woe is me attitude, waiting for everybody else to sort out her problems. Not Ruth. She believed that God would provide, and she took the steps to find out how God would provide. And provide He did, and in some amazing ways. And so this is what we can see in ourselves. This is what the passage tells us, both as individuals and as a church. When faced with challenges, when faced with the uncertainty, when we have situations that are really difficult to face, let's trust God. We really, really need to trust God. And where appropriate, rather than doing nothing about the situation, take those first steps of faith. Yes, we may not quite see the full picture, but God will continue to lead, to direct, and to provide. Faith doesn't necessarily mean doing nothing. It sometimes calls us to do something. And if this is the situation where you find yourself this morning, maybe facing a difficult situation, facing a challenging time, maybe paralyzed by fear, by doubt, by hesitation, it may well be that God is saying to you, trust me. I am dependable. And then take those first steps that will lead you to the place that I'm preparing for you. Let me also say that this message is so appropriate for us as a church, so timely for us as a church. We know that God has got good plans for us. He's encouraging us to move to a new future, new fields, new areas of work, a new direction. And it is true that we don't know what the final destination will look like. We don't quite know what our church will look like in 3, 4, 5 years' time. But what God is saying to us today is simply, trust me. Don't keep on holding to the present or the past and do nothing. Take those first steps, and I will continue to lead, to direct, and to provide for you. And as we continue to take step after step after step, you'll discover that I'm trustworthy, that I have good plans for you, plans to prosper you, not to harm you, plans to give you hope and a future. So, Father, thank you for these words that we find in Ruth, for they challenge us to depend upon you, to know that you are a trustworthy God, you are faithful to your people, you are faithful to each one of us individually, Lord. And for those moments in our lives when we have to face challenges, when we have to face difficult situations, help us to have this absolute trust, knowing that you are there with us. And then if you lead us, help us to take those first steps that will bring to us a future that you have planned for us. And I pray for that for each one of us individually, but also for us as a church. May we continue to trust you, but help us not just to stand still. Take those first steps. that will take us to the future that you've prepared for us. In Jesus' name, amen. Amen.